Hi, good afternoon, welcome. I was told that the buffet will open after I'm done speaking, which is a great incentive for me to talk very quickly. But I will go forward nevertheless. My name is Mike French. I'm Vice President for Space Systems at the Aerospace Industries Association. AIA represents nearly 340 companies across the aerospace and defense industry, and is celebrating its 100th year, its centennial this year. Our industry supports over 2.5 million jobs here in the United States and represents about 20% of the United States' manufacturing workforce. On the international level, we are deeply involved in international trade and aviation issues, as well as support U.S. industry's presence on major events like the Paris Air Show. The panels and conversations I've had over the last few days have shown the global interest in how government can leverage and support the commercial space industry. I would like to spend some time with you this afternoon to examine the drivers behind this interest, how those drivers shape our current partnership landscape, and what that may mean for the future. Let's start with the origins of this interest. The underpinning of government's partnership interest is a recognition of a measurable increase in private funding and new company formation in the space sector. Over $20 billion has been invested in the space sector since 2000, with the formation of over 300 plus firms, with most of that activity occurring over the last 5 years. While this funding in itself has caught the government's attention, there's also been a real impact from the high public nature and public interest of this activity. Rocket launches and commercial human spaceflight capture the interest of government as well as the public. Here on the slide, I have a picture of one of those very exciting moments. This is Virgin Galactic's Beth Moses on her first flight earlier this year. Having recognized the private investment in space, there are several specific drivers behind government's partnership interest. The first is capability-oriented. The government wants to know if this private sector investment has resulted in new capabilities that the government can take advantage of to meet its own needs. The second is economically oriented. Does the private investment signal a national or regional economic opportunity that the government should foster or support? This is energized by a fear of missing out. As more countries see this as an emerging field, no country wants to be the last country to enter into the market. Third, the government wants to know if the private funding is signaling the rise of a new market. Why does this matter? Let's consider printer paper. The governments use a lot of printer paper. However, governments are not in the business of making printer paper. The government acts as one of many customers of printer paper and buys printer paper off the shelf at competitive prices. The government wants to know if this private funding is signaling an area that is becoming more like printer paper, where it can adjust how it then buys this service in the future. So thinking about these three drivers have resulted in the growth of three partnership areas in particular. The first of those partnership areas is an increase in pilots and what I call pilots and accelerators. These models have a strong connection to the capability driver. Here, the government is generally spending small sums of money in order to touch as many of these new companies as possible to see if they have capabilities that they can take advantage of. These programs also typically have an educational and technical assistance aspect to them. The assumption here is that these companies do not have the resources or the background to partner with the government in themselves. And we've heard a lot about these kind of partnerships over the last few days in several forums. Some of the examples being the Starburst Accelerator, the Catapult program in the UK, and some of the types of grants and funding that the Defense Innovation Unit's doing here in the United States. The second model where we've seen a lot more interest from is direct investment. Here, governments have set up funds, either directly or in conjunction with private sector funders, to directly fund companies. This model can typically provide capability insight, as well as long-term market creation, but has often been a focus of the economic development driver. What's interesting is the U.S. has typically been shy of using these type of arrangements. The one exception is the intelligence community's group, InQtel, here in the United States. An interesting aspect of InQtel is that when it makes an investment, it also looks to have an internal U.S. government customer that's going to take advantage of that capability. So a second aspect to just funding dollars. And this is a bit of a secret sauce that I think is worth considering in other models. The third model, which I'd like to talk about, is because it's a bit different, is the public investment private service model. This model is closely tied to the market creation driver. Under this model, the government is helping fund the creation of a future private service. Let's go back to my printer paper example to explain this. Imagine that the government, in this case, is helping a private company fund the development of a printer paper factory and guarantees future printer paper purchases. The paper factory will then sell that paper to private customers and to the government. So why do this, right? Theoretically, this will result in lower prices to the government than if the government built and ran the factory indefinitely. A well-known example of this is NASA's commercial cargo and crew programs. Under these programs, NASA funded development costs and guaranteed future business in order to have several private companies able to provide this service into the future. It's important to note when we think about the pilots and the accelerators, these are often in small dollar scales, single millions, under $1 million, maybe $5 million. When we think about this public investment private service model, we're talking about a much more significant level of investment. And so, why don't we take a look at here? So I'd love to, take a look here and love your guess here of how much NASA's invested in its commercial cargo and crew programs. So I have 900 million, 3.9 billion, 7.5 billion, and 17.8 billion. In fact, the answer here is D. NASA's invested over $17 billion in its crew and cargo programs. So very significant development level funding versus the million, 1 million, 5 million type pilots and grants of that nature. So we've discussed the three drivers and the three growing models. And so to understand where we might be headed, to understand where we're headed in the future, we need to take a deeper look at the market and a deeper look at the partnership landscape. And so let's look a bit about where this private investment has gone. So the question again here for you, if we look over the last 5 years, about $12.5 billion has been invested in private entities. And think about what percentage of that do you think has gone to the top three recipients of that funding, right? So 7%, 18, 47, 72. Nearly half of that money has gone in the last 5 years to three companies: SpaceX, Blue Origin, and OneWeb, which is a company looking to develop a low Earth orbit mega constellation. The other quarter of that funding has gone essentially to 8 other companies, with the rest, 25%, going to 100 plus some companies. So let's, when we think about this, what does this mean about, sort of future implications? First, it means the government needs to understand that the large influx of money in itself doesn't tell you that much, right? It's created a host of different size firms, right? From billion-dollar firms to $100 million firms to firms receiving, in some cases, even less than $1 million of startup funding. It also means that when we use the label startup or new entrant, it can become a poor shorthand to cover such a wide, diverse set of actors. And so in forming future partnerships, the government needs to consider this more nuanced makeup of the community and whether a particular model is better suited for the purpose of the driver, whether you're looking for capabilities, you're looking for economic development, or you're looking for market creation. It's also it's not just important to consider the diversity investment, but the diversity of the markets that these companies are working in. So let's get a sense of sort of these market segments. So my next question here for the group, the global launch industry, which obviously gets quite a bit of attention. What size? How your thoughts on sort of where do you think that weighs versus other U.S. markets? And so the U.S. potato chip industry, the U.S. Halloween candy sold each year, movie tickets in the United States, or bottled water. And so so the answer actually is potato chips. So last year, the launch industry was about $8 billion. Potato chips, about that range. Halloween candy, $9 billion. Movie tickets, about $12 billion. And bottled water, which we should all get in the bottled water business, $18 billion to possibly up to $30 billion of a market. And so why do I say this, right? Why do I raise this? I raise this because launch has such an outsized impact in our industry. It captures the imagination, also is so enabling, but it can skew our understanding of the market and where some of these new capabilities and new actors are. And so to look at where the market is, the commercial space market's about a $280 billion market, primarily made up of satellite communications and supporting industries. There are a host of new actors in areas that are emerging or pre-revenue markets. For example, just in the last month, a very exciting development of Northrop Grumman's MEV vehicle was put in orbit to go service a satellite. An emerging market, but not one yet that's a large part of the existing commercial space sector. We also the next year may see a new market in suborbital tourism, looking for a future of low Earth orbit tourism. And then we have a series of other activities that are emerging, but not yet in the pie of where folks are making money today. And so what does this mean? So what does this mean for future considerations? Returning back to the government drivers, the presence of an existing or emerging market is important to which driver we want to focus on. Where you have a robust existing market, there's a commercial customer who can already use one of the new capabilities. And in those cases, government can use that as a signal in terms of whether that's a capability the government can take advantage of. In this case, the government might not have to spend as much money or put as much grant money out, but the job could be one of education or of awareness, similar to some of the accelerators or incubators we've been seeing a lot of activity on this week. It can also, though, signal which areas are most ripe for economic development. A country can see where its own homegrown new entrants are doing well in an existing commercial market and decide to focus on there for that economic development purpose. In the areas of emerging markets, this is also where the government consider whether this is the role where it wants to play for a very significant development effort to create a new market. And here we have a very interesting example going on where NASA, in addition to the cargo model we had before and the crew model that's still ongoing, NASA's using that model for its human lunar landers. And so this is an extension of that model beyond some of the existing market activity we had, for example, with the cargo program. So we've looked at where this investment has gone and what that means. We've looked at these different markets and what that may mean. It's also important to put this investment in context. So last year we had a little less than $3 billion in venture capital that went into the space industry. Overall last year there was about $131 billion of venture funding in the United States. The level of venture funding in space was about equal to some of the venture funding in Bitcoin and led blockchain type activities. We also need to look at some other investments going on in the market that are quite significant. So last year, the top 25 aerospace and defense firms invested about $17 billion in internal R&D, right? So again, it doesn't mean the investment's not significant. It certainly has been significant in historical terms in space, but it means we have to consider this in thinking about what this means for future partnerships. When you think about that in that context, it's similar to what we saw with the spread of funding. You need to consider not just the overall level, but where is that funding going to any one company or any one market, and does that mean you need to have a different model depending on the driver of the government? And so putting all this together, as we look to the future of partnerships, policies need to understand the nuances of the commercial space market. As we saw from the spread of funding, there's not a monolithic group of startups. We have, some companies that are very highly funded and looking to do government business as part of their business model. We also have hundreds of much lower funded firms working across these markets. You also have a new nuance in the funding of these entities. Large A&D firms like Boeing and Lockheed Martin are now major and some of the more active investors in the space sector. Some of the things on this slide include Boeing's investment in Virgin Galactic, Lockheed has invested in Rocket Lab as well as ABL Space Systems, and just earlier this week, Firefly and Aerojet Rocketdyne announced a partnership. And a couple areas where you can see examples of how this nuance is actually playing out in some real partnerships and in industry's activities. And the first I'd say is if we look at the partners in NASA's Commercial Crew and Cargo programs. So if you look at those partners, the 4 primary partners are actually a mix of 2 large publicly traded A&D firms in Boeing and Northrop Grumman, as well as 2 mid-sized privately held firms in Sierra Nevada Corporation and SpaceX. I think another very interesting example of this nuance is what we saw this week. With a couple days ago with the announcement by Blue Origin, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and Draper Labs on partnering as a competitor in NASA's Human Lunar Lander program. And I think this is interesting because it's a signal by industry itself that it is seen where capabilities lie regardless of funding model or market or time and formation, and coming together to say competitively, we think this is where we can meet a government need. And so what does a government policy maker do with all this? The first thing is to return to the driver of why you're having a partnership. Whether it's capability-driven, economically development-driven, or new market creation, the government policymaker needs to consider this nuance and decide whether the actual firms in the market they're looking at need which one of those tools in the toolkit they should use to maximize their driver at their government need driver. And so with this, I'll close and let you eat, which is an important part of everyone's day. But we'll say that Aerospace Industry Association will be tracking these issues very closely and continue to be thinking about this and seeing how government and industry can work together to, at the end of the day, meet government's capabilities in the most effective way. So thank you very much.